Okay, can you hear me all right? Okay, good. Yeah, we'll go ahead and run through this. And yeah, I'm really excited about, the number of people that have chosen to come. I'm not sure if it's an indication of interest or boredom, but I'll take it either way. So I'm going to start with an overview of some of the topics that we are going to touch against, and then run through a little bit of an inventory of different methods for quantitatively assessing perceived usability and other aspects related to it. Then show how that ties into a current, not so current now, it's a couple of years old, controversy and some research that was just published earlier this year that touches on that controversy. So, you guys are all involved in the business, so you have a pretty good idea about what usability is. Sometimes we don't really realize that the use of the word usability actually runs back a ways, as you can see in this refrigerator advertisement where they are promoting as proof number 4 that it has more usability than the competition. It's handier to use. It saves steps and saves work. And, those are clearly, related to the efficiency aspect of usability as we define it now. But beyond giving those kinds of labels, usability has traditionally been hard to define. It's not really a property of a person or thing. We don't have any usability thermometers. One of the insights that came out of the late 80s rolling through the 1990s, which culminated in both ANSI and ISO standards, is that usability is an emergent property that depends on interactions among users, products, tasks, and environments. In those standards, the typical metrics include effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction. Today, we're mostly going to be talking about satisfaction or instruments related to satisfaction, those that have to do with the perception of quality rather than any objective instrumentation. So that gets us to the topic of standardized usability measurement. So starting into standardized usability measurement, we take a step back and say, well, what does it mean for something to be standardized? So we're going to hit, what is a standardized questionnaire? What are some of their advantages? What usability questionnaires are out there, at least a subset of them, and how do you assess the quality of a standardized questionnaire? So the main characteristics of a standardized questionnaire is that it's designed for repeated use. It typically involves a specific set of questions presented in a specific order using a specified format. There are specific rules for producing metrics from the responses. And it is customary for those designing these types of instruments to report measurements of psychometric quality, such as reliability, validity, and sensitivity. And a characteristic of standardized usability questionnaires is that it touches on participant satisfaction with products or systems, usually through trying to get an understanding of perceived usability. So why do we do this? Well, in science at large, the advantage of standardized measurement is that it's objective. I don't change it for a specific context. So and you're kind of jumping around through this list, and then that enhances communication, because if I say that I use the system usability scale, then you have a pretty good idea about what I did. This makes studies easier to replicate. It makes reporting of quantification easier. And even though these can be difficult and time consuming to develop and to validate, once you've got it, then reuse is very easy. Now, I did put a key disadvantage down here for these, and because you're trying to create something that can be used across a wide variety of contexts, then there is a lack of diagnostic specificity. What people usually do is, if there are context-specific questions that are interested in, then those will be asked separately in the study, along with the use of the standardized questionnaire to try to get the best of both worlds. Now, there are a ton of instruments that are available. Historically, going back to the 1970s, some standardized instruments began to pop up for MIS reports, computer acceptance. Rolling more into the 1980s, mostly the latter half of the 1980s, you began to see some questionnaires pop up that were specifically designed for use at the end of a usability study. So that's the quiz, the SUMI, use, PSSUQ, SUS, UMUX, and UMUX-LITE. Some of those latter ones you may not be familiar with. That's actually part of what we're going to be talking quite a bit about today. There are post-task questionnaires, the after-scenario questionnaire, expectation ratings, trying to do usability magnitude estimation. All of these things have been explored. Not all of them work that well, but they're there in the inventory. When websites came along, there were a number of instruments developed specific to website usability, trying to touch on things that were new with the web, such as concerns about trust, concerns about security, things like that. Now, there are other questionnaires that also have been developed, the CSUQ. There are a whole set of European questionnaires where part of the defining characteristic is a distinction between pragmatic usability and hedonic quality, trying to get into more of the emotional space. That's the attractive, the UEQ, and the MEQ. The EMO is also a questionnaire that's very much focused on relationships and emotional aspects of interaction. And then there are some more corporate types of measurements that companies have used, the ACSI, the NPS, Forrester CXPI, and something we are going to be returning to, the technology acceptance model. Now, when you assess quality, the top two are assessments of reliability and validity. And throughout the 20th century, techniques were developed for trying to get at those characteristics of a standardized instrument. Everything that I say here, there is still a certain amount of debate in the measurement community about what the exact best way is to do things. Keep in mind that those debates usually aren't that one way is totally flawed and another way is absolutely superior. It's just, debates about, one technique having a slight advantage over another. But what I'm talking about here is associated with a set of methods that are known as CTT, classical test theory. So reliability in that way of doing things is usually measured with a technique called coefficient alpha. Coefficient alpha can run from 0 to 1, and for measures that are intended for research and evaluation, Your goal is to get a coefficient alpha that is equal to or exceeds 0.7. There are a lot of different types of validity, but we'll just talk about a couple of them here. Content validity has to do with where did the items come from that go into the instrument. And there is no statistic or measurement associated with that. That's a process validity. So as long as the items have been collected in a reasonable way by domain experts or use of pre-existing questions in slightly different ways, you would usually take that as evidence or proof that the content is valid. Concurrent or predictive validity is established through correlation with other metrics. And as you know, correlations can go from -1 to +1. And there are methods for determining when correlation is significant. You get to construct validity through a procedure called factor analysis. And factor analysis helps you determine, for example, if you have sets of items clustering in a way that would justify the development of subscales in an overall measurement, or whether it looks like everything is kind of hanging together and it's just measuring one construct. Sensitivity is basically using the instruments and using them to test, for example, if you've got two websites and based on other qualitative research that one is likely to have a greater degree of perceived usability than another, then you're able to, if you're able to demonstrate that with T or F tests, then you have established that your measure is sensitive to those differences, that it is able to detect, and for you to be able to prove using that measure that there are differences in perceived usability. Now, scale items. This is something that people love to spend a lot of time arguing about. And over the past few years, I've made some investments, and Jeff Sauro has also made some investments in trying to see how many of these things actually matter in the context of user experience research. So one thing is, how many scale steps should you have in your items? And there's research back from the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s even, that shows that you usually increase reliability by increasing the number of scale steps. You usually hit a limit at around 11 points. There's no, you can have 101 points, but there's really no practical difference between that and 11 points, and indeed no real difference for 7, 11, or 101 points. We find that 3-point scales in isolation tend to perform particularly poorly. Now, if you use my point here, the number of scale steps is more important for single item instruments than it is for multi-item instruments. Once you start adding additional items, then even 3-point scales work perfectly fine. Forced choice, should you allow people to select a neutral option? And the presence or absence of a neutral option can slightly wiggle things around in your measurement, but it's another one of those design decisions that doesn't really matter much, especially for the kind of research we're talking about, where you're going to be averaging across participants or averaging across items in a multi-item scale. And it is the case that most standardized usability questionnaires use an odd number of steps, because in most cases, neutral is considered a valid sentiment to hold. If you don't have it there, then you push people out into sentiments that they may not actually want to express. Item types, Likert scales are those that are made up of statements that you agree or disagree with. Another common way of setting up an item type is to have item-specific endpoints. But in research that I've done and replicated a couple of times, if you are very careful with your item wording and the way you build the endpoints, if you make two forms of a questionnaire, one of which is agreement items, the other of which is item specific, it's very rare for there to be any difference in the ratings. So the point is, any common item design is okay. A scale designer has to make a choice for standardization, but normally the time spent arguing about these kinds of issues is wasted time. Now, also need to talk a little bit about norms, because you build these things and you can have people provide ratings, you get a number. And by itself, any score, individual or average, it has no meaning. If you don't have norms, then you can provide an aspect of meaning through comparison, either by comparing against benchmarks or comparing two sets of data using standard statistics, TRF tests. But another way to compare is to get comparison with norms. To do that, you have to collect a lot of data from representative groups. And once you have your norms, then independent of other specific sets of data, by looking at your data against the norms, you get some assessment of how good you are in either how good or poor you're doing. There's always a risk that your sample might not match the norms. Make sure you understand where they came from. But when you have norms, that is a step up. Instruments that have been normed have generally more value than those that have not. So here's a list of what I think are probably the most common instruments. And usually when I'm teaching a course, this is where I pause and ask, does anybody have any experience with any of these? And my little stop sign down there means this is where I'm supposed to stop and see if there are any questions.
Yeah, there's nothing in the chat right now, but maybe people could just type in the chat any of these that they're fairly familiar with. That might be interesting.
Yeah, we'll see what happens as I go along.
So we'll just give people a second to type in there. If you use any of these, you can just type them in. I do have a question while we're waiting. Like, as you mentioned, norms are a very big contributor to the usefulness of a scale. Could you say a bit more about the state of the art, about like how good is normative information available, if like certainly in the public domain?
This is it's interesting. There, about 10 or 15 years ago, my answer would have been, there really isn't much of anything, except possibly the SUMI, which I don't know if any of y'all know Jurek Kirikovsky. He's with he's at a university in Ireland, and this was one of his babies, was getting the SUMI set up and then having lots of people use it. And I think they also continuously conduct their own research with it to try to keep a set of to have a normative database to provide reports against. Jeff Sauro does the same thing with the SuperQ. And the important distinction between those two and everything else on this page is that they're the ones that are not free. I mean, you can use their items freely, but to get reports that take advantage of the curated normative databases, you have to have a license. As I'm going to talk about in just a little bit, the system usability scale is probably the best free instrument to use with regard to the open, what I would call open source norms that have been developed over the past 10 or so years.
Okay. Great. Last call for anybody have any questions they want to type in the chat before we move on?
Paul, it's Mark Chignall here. I was just going to say that I always use SUS in courses and research, so that to me is kind of like the default.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Thanks.
Okay, shall I continue? Yep. Okay, here we go. So in 2018, some of you may know Noam Trachtenski or know of him. Probably one of the things he's best known for is a paper about the relationship between usability and beauty. But in 2018, he published a paper in HCI that basically said, you know, this whole construct of usability, it just hasn't been very useful to the community. Now, reaction to that paper was mixed. Generally, people responding to it, you know how HCI is set up. You know, somebody writes an article and they have a whole bunch of comments on it. So kind of the consensus was, well, there's some valuable arguments in here, but, you know, there's still, you know, is it really, or is the situation really that bad? And in my own reading of it, you know, I spotted some things that I didn't particularly agree with, so that you can, if you're interested, you can get those for free at the Journal of Usability Studies website. And that's in the 11/2018 issue. I wrote an essay for that. But one of the things he did was he mentioned the technology acceptance model as a good example of doing constructs in science and practice. So we got, you know, interested in, well, you know, I'll show you the technology acceptance model in a little bit, but there is a key component of the technology acceptance model that really seems to be very close to the concept of perceived usability. So as we move forward, we're going to cover pretty quickly some research on the system usability scale, the technology adoption. That should have been acceptance. I'm always doing that. And the Net Promoter Score, and a relatively new, excuse me, gotta move this guy. Relatively new measure of perceived usability, the UMUX-LITE. And when we get to the UMUX-LITE, and I'll go a little bit about its origins, its properties, its correspondence with the SUS, relationship to the technology acceptance model, and kind of the role that it can play relative to Net Promoter Scores, which are somewhat you know, controversial in themselves in the UX world. So let me get started. Okay, the system usability scale was developed in the mid-1980s, but it wasn't published until the mid-1990s. This is by John Brook. So it is, you know, really it is the most popular post-study questionnaire. It was self-described as quick and dirty, but as more as more data was gathered, it was clear that it is fairly quick, but it really doesn't seem to be all that dirty. Now, in its initial publication, the sample size was 20. In my own database, I've got over 10,000 cases. So, you know, and I'm not the only person doing research with it. So it's designed to be a unidimensional measure of perceived usability, has good reliability. I mentioned coefficient alpha. Your target is usually about 0.7. It comes in at 0.92. And it has also demonstrated good concurrent validity with other related measures collected at the same time. So these are the items. Some of the things to know about it. Originally, item 8 uses cumbersome. There's been some research that says it's okay to replace that with awkward. Sometimes people who are speakers of English as a second language have a little bit of trouble with cumbersome that they don't have with awkward. You can replace this system with this website or Gmail or whatever you want to replace it with. And I'm not going to get into the how you compute the score, but it has, because of the mixed tone of the items, it's a little bit complicated to get the sus score. But the important thing is to know that it ranges from 0 to 100 once you've done it. 0 if everybody gives a rating that would indicate poor perceived usability, 100 if they give ratings that indicate the highest level. A while back, Jeff Sauro, now see, I mentioned I've got about 10,000 cases. Some of those are cases that Jeff Sauro had collected when we began collaborating. And in 2016, well, actually in 2012, we put this table together based on data from 446 usability studies or surveys. And it has remained pretty stable over that time. In this particular table, a 68 was the exact center of the scale. We wanted to create a curve grading scale because the distribution of sus scores themselves isn't normal. When you are taking averages, the central limit theorem does bring it into line pretty quickly at relatively small sample sizes. So we don't worry about running standard statistics on it. But when it comes to interpreting it, based on these 446 studies, these are the way the percentiles worked out. In 2013, Corman Banger ran the sus on a large number of products, what they called everyday products, most of them best in class. And these were the kinds of ratings that they got. We actually see this as being reasonably consistent with the grading scale that we set up. You certainly expect Excel to be more difficult than, say, using an ATM or doing a Google search. So the interpretation here is that if you're working in one of these areas that's more extreme, then you probably need to set your bar higher than you would. You know, a very common practice in industry now is to try to get a sus score of 80. If I step back, you can kind of see that 80 falls at the lower part of the A range on our grading scale. So we generally see that as a reasonable target for people to try to achieve, but not if you're working in a specialty area like spreadsheets or search engines. Your goals should be adjusted accordingly. The technology acceptance model was developed in by information systems researchers who are dealing with UX type problems, but mostly trying to understand why aren't people using the software that they are being directed to use by their employers. And the key element here is that there are two elements: perceived usability and perceived ease of use. And with those two constructs, they're able to do a pretty good job of determining the relationship between those and someone's intention to use, and then their actual use in the original research. Because they demonstrated a relationship between intention to use and actual use in the original research, that allowed a lot of people to explore other aspects of technology acceptance by just seeing how various variables affected perceived usefulness and ease of use. And these are the traditional items for perceived usefulness and perceived ease of use. And the item content and format, you can kind of see how they were doing this. So keep in mind that this has to do with the prediction of future use, not an assessment of experience. Now let's just take a little step to the side and just briefly review the Net Promoter Score. This was introduced in 2003 by Fred Reichheld and is a metric that is computed from a likelihood to recommend scale. So I've got the one up here that you can see. It's usually set up as a 0 to 10 scale. And when Net Promoter Score is computed from this, it's done as what's called a top box minus bottom box metric. So you look at the percentage of those who rated 9s and 10s and subtract the percentage of those who rated 0 through 6. Accordingly, the NPS can range from -100 to +100. If your percentage of detractors and promoters are the same, you get a 0. And now another sideways step to the usability metric for user experience, the UMUX. Now this was developed by Craig Finstad at Intel, published in 2010. He was trying to get a 4-item proxy for the SUS. He thought that, sometimes having to ask 10 items was kind of onerous. He wanted to get it down to 4. Did it based on the ISO definition of usability. And once he got to his, he started with a pool of 12 items. He wound up with 4 after analysis. And the 4 items turned, these are the 4 items that he came up with. Now, I came across this in 2010. Around 2011, 2012, I was talking to some other folks doing UX research at IBM, and they were really excited about the possibility of using a 4-item instrument instead of 10, because a lot of their research was done in large surveys, and that made survey real estate really valuable. So if you could get the same kind of measure with 4 items instead of 10, they were really interested in that. So we tried to replicate the work that Finstad had done, and we came up with very similar results. So that was pretty exciting. But what was also exciting was that when we looked at the UMUX structure, there was some bidimensionality in the metric based on the positive and negative items. Just like the SUS, there's a rotation. Items 1 and 3 here are positive statements. Items 2 and 4 are negative statements. This is, for a long time, was considered to be good practice in questionnaire development. There is a fair amount of evidence that it actually leads to what's called nuisance structure in your measure. But save that for another talk. But it turned out that if we just extracted the 2 positive tone items, we were also getting a measure that corresponded very closely with the system usability scale. And think back to the technology acceptance model. It was a measure of usefulness and ease of use. And if you look at Finstad's 2 positive tone items, this system's capabilities meet my requirements, and this system is easy to use, then the parallel is kind of striking. So over a number of years, starting in 2013, we've conducted a number of sets of research, multiple surveys. We find that the UMUX-LITE has acceptable reliability. It's correlates very closely with the SUS, correlates very closely with the likelihood to recommend scale that is the basis of the Net Promoter Score. And, it does very well. So anyway, this is my next stopping point.
Thanks, Jeff. Or Jim. Yeah, I like your stop sign there. It's very,
yeah.
very useful. Yeah. So again, I invite anybody who's got any questions either to type them in the chat or to speak them out if you're unmuted.
This is the best news I've heard in a long time. It's Alona here. So we can now ask 2 questions and go home.
Well, it's you can, if you're going to ask 2 questions, these are probably 2 of the most important ones to ask. You can certainly ask more.
Right. I like to ask, would you use it?
Yeah, that's a good one, and that ties into most of my stuff. I've looked at likelihood to recommend as opposed to likelihood to use, because the Net Promoter Score has become so ubiquitous across the industry that I like to see how manipulations in perceived usability potentially wiggle likelihood to recommend, which, depending upon exactly where people land, it either wiggles or has no effect on Net Promoter Scores.
I find when I use the Net Promoter Score and the recommend, and they start going into things like, well, they have to have the need for it. Why would I go recommending this thing that I'm just like, you just invited me to talk about that I'm not a user of, and like, why would I, I don't really go out of my way imposing my opinion on people. So I get this kind of conversation. Like, okay, that's not
there it is. I didn't expect Canadian politeness to trip this all up.
Sorry.
But, and you apologize too. Okay. But no, the part of the interest in the UMUX-LITE, and I'll get into this later too, is that these 2 questions, even though we can demonstrate, as you'll see when I get into some of the data, that changes in the UMUX-LITE, well, as you can see, just the concurrent validity, the correlation with likelihood to recommend, when you're getting correlations around 0.73 or 0.74, that means that variation in the answers to the UMUX-LITE are accounting for almost 50% of the variation in likelihood to recommend. So what that then becomes is a very powerful argument for the user experience practitioner to say, if you want improvements in likelihood to recommend, then you really should be considering improvements in UX.
Yeah, I see in the chat someone's raised their hand, so maybe you have a question or comment. So you could either unmute yourself and share it or type it in the chat, please. In the meantime, I just wondering, you've sort of mentioned very briefly about the controversy about the construct of usability. Could you just say a bit more about what the argument was, or what the gist of it was? Was it about usefulness versus usability, or was it some other sort of topic? Or,
in my opinion, it was a very academic criticism. There apparently, since I had my courses in psychometrics in the 1980s, disciplines don't stay still, and I was not deeply involved in necessarily staying current with some of the changes in psychometrics. There is a concept of what's called an umbrella construct, which is you just throw a bunch of things together in a bag and then say, I've developed a construct. but when I went through Traktinsky's arguments suggesting that the construct of usability was such an umbrella construct, one where the items that make it up were not highly correlated. Part of his argument was, well, there's so much evidence that there's low correlation between, say, the objective aspects of usability and the perceived usability. Who hasn't had an experience where somebody just performed terribly, and then they gave really, really great ratings to the product they were just working with? But back in 2009, Jeff Sauro reached out to the UX community and collected a bunch of unpublished usability study data that had been anonymized, enough so that we were able to run through them and look at the correlations between efficiency, effectiveness, and satisfaction, typically measured with SUS. The correlations were not perfect, but they were uniformly at least at the study level, or I believe it's definitely at the task level, uniformly positive correlations and significant. So I think part of what's happening is that when this event happens where there's this huge disconnect between a person's performance and the ratings they provide, that just really leaves a mark on our consciousness. We remember that. And we don't necessarily remember quite so vividly when things went in the normal way. So I thought that his arguments were a little outdated there. He didn't seem to be aware of that research. And then when you develop an instrument like one of mine, the PSSUQ, if you break it up into subscales, you do that on the basis of principal components or factor analysis, which suggests, the way those work is you're supposed to be separating it into independent subscales. But in practice, those subscales are not independent. They usually correlate, usually at least around 0.6 or 0.7 with each other. So there still is evidence of an underlying common construct, and that's what I would say usability is.
Good. Okay, we've got a couple of questions or comments in the chat, so I'll maybe summarize them here. So the first one has to do with, I guess, synonyms here. So this person's proposing that effectiveness is really the same or synonymous with the system meets the requirements, and efficiency is really, the same as ease of use. So
okay. So what was the second one? Ease of use and perceived usability?
Efficiency equals ease of use. Do you have any comments on that? Is that how you think about it? Or?
Well, when it comes to, okay, I think that sticking with the ISO conceptualization, then effectiveness is most commonly assessed as the ability to complete a task. And efficiency is most often associated with the speed with which you're able to complete the task. Now, there are variations of that, but I would say that those are the two most common ways that those are translated from a concept into a measure for usability testing. But those are objective. Either the person completes or fails to complete, and the person is either efficient or feels like they were constantly encountering errors, even if they did eventually manage to get to the desired end state. Then for the UMUX-LITE, the I don't know, it's usually for okay, going back to the technology acceptance model. So we have perceived usefulness and perceived ease of use. And we may be making a little bit of a stretch in that functional adequacy may not be the whole of usefulness. But certainly, if it doesn't do what I need it to do at all, then it's going to be deficient in usefulness. And then ease of use, we've consistently found that to be probably the most, the most important thing to ask when it comes to trying to get an assessment of perceived usability. Again, it may not be the whole of perceived usability, but it's a very important component of it.
Okay, just one final question here. So just to summarize it, I think this has to do with the SUS scale, and there's a question about frequent use. And the person was saying if the tool isn't meant to be used frequently, how appropriate
what
is
do you
that question?
do?
Yeah, what do you do?
Yes. Actually, if you go to the Journal of Usability Studies, Jeff Sauro and I took the data that we had at that time. It was probably over 9,000 cases, and we set out to find out what would, this especially for item 1, which is problematic in that way. What would happen if you just pulled that out? Because we know that the items of the SUS do tend to be intercorrelated with one another. So the extraction of one item should not make a big difference to the overall score as long as you adjust your multiplier properly. And because of the SUS's having both positive and negative tone items, the way that you need to do your score adjustment gets a little complicated, but we actually have that. And I should go ahead and let you all know, I have a presence on ResearchGate, and I am very happy to share any of the stuff that I've published. So you don't have to worry about going through some firewall or something like that. Just contact me and let me know. A couple of years ago, I did a survey paper for the International Journal of Human-Computer Interaction on the SUS, and that paper has all of the extra research that Jeff and I have conducted with the SUS, including can I leave this one out, and how you what happens to the scores when you do that. Spoiler alert: the scores don't change as long as you adjust the multiplier properly. All the scores stay within a point on a 100-point scale, and I'm talking about the outer edges of confidence intervals across the averages. So the scores just don't change. If that item is inappropriate, you can just yank it out. Use a 9-item version of the SUS, adjust your scores properly so you can still get a 0 to 100 points, and nobody's going to know, nobody's going to care. You should just, when you do the, if you publish it, you should, mention that that you made that modification.
Great. Well, I think a lot of people are breathing a sigh of relief. That's great news. Just in the interest of time, maybe we should move on.
Okay. So now let me talk about the latest research. This is a paper that was published earlier this year, and I had a couple of collaborators from Slovenia. Why Slovenia? I don't know. They contacted me and said they were interested in doing some research, and I said I was interested in doing this, and this is what we did. So it all required translation of things into Slovene, but anyway, just part of the process. So here we looked at, we conducted 3 additional surveys, one looking at PowerPoint, one at Gmail, one at Notes. A lot of my research in this has been done with an IBM panel that I put together, about 2,000 people that agreed to volunteer to take part in these kinds of surveys. We looked at 3 standardized questionnaires, the SUS, the UMUX, and a modified version of the TAM. Now, you may recall that the TAM items and the TAM items are set up to ask about intended future use. So the modification was just barely modifying them so that you're asking people to assess their experience with it using those same items rather than projecting future use. We use a Latin square to counterbalance the order of presentation, and it turned out that the order of presentation didn't matter in any of the cases, whether people saw the SUS, UMUX, or modified TAM first. So first off, what are the psychometrics? We saw, kind of universally acceptable levels of reliability. The items mostly align with constructs. There was one misalignment in the Slovenian version, so I'm a little concerned about the translation of the 6th item in the TAM, but not going to obsess over that. And we saw the kind of convergent and divergent validity you would expect, in that all of these correlations with the SUS, for example, are significant. But if you look at, here I've got LITE-PU, that's the first item of the LITE, which is more perceived usefulness. The second item of the LITE is perceived ease of use. These are being assessed with 1 7-point scale each. In the modified TAM, if you break down the items, the first 6 items are those related to perceived usefulness. The second set are those related to perceived ease of use. And what you see for the perceived usefulness is, yes, these are still pretty high correlations, but it turns out that in every case, they are statistically significantly lower than the correlation of the ease of use item with the SUS. So, and this is kind of what you would expect. The SUS is a measure of perceived usability. So even though there is still relationship, it's not that they are uncorrelated. We're seeing stronger relationship with items that are associated with perceived ease of use than with those that are perceived with perceived usefulness. The next thing we checked was, let's look at some regression models and see how these various measures influence likelihood to recommend, which I showed you, or a single item devoted to assessing your overall experience, which was also done with a 0 to 10-point scale and 11-point scale. And what we see is that across the studies, the regression models are significant, tending to be, you're getting a pretty good explanation of the relationship between variation in your predictors and variation in the variable being predicted across the surveys. The highest was for notes and the lowest for Gmail. I didn't talk much about this earlier, but Notes is a program that IBM employees are absolutely required to use. Gmail, which was done with the Slovenian group, that was a mail service they chose to use. So I think that some of this may be related to different levels of choice. When you don't have much of a choice in use, then usefulness, perceived usefulness, and perceived ease of use are almost the only games in town when it comes to wiggling, likelihood to recommend, or particularly just your expression of overall experience. When you have more choices, that means there are other elements that may be able to creep in and account for some of the variation. Now, the other thing I was interested in from the kind of the theoretical perspective is, what if I just took, what if I did the predictions with the modified TAM, but then I just substituted the SUS scores for the perceived ease of use scores? And again, the models are almost identical, which says to me that SUS and perceived ease of use, at least when it comes to their relationship to likelihood to recommend or overall experience, are essentially interchangeable. Perceived ease of use is just another measure of the construct of perceived usability. And then getting to the UMUX-LITE, what if I just take those two items, the LITE PU and LITE PEU, those are items 1 and 2 of the UMUX-LITE. And again, we see very similar regression models. Looking at how they account for variation in these measures. And the coefficients of determination are a little bit smaller, and in some cases statistically so, but still, fairly large. The UMUX-LITE items do a pretty good job of predicting variation, or accounting for variation is probably the better way to put it, in likelihood to recommend and ratings of overall experience. This just shows you the research that's been done to date and looking at the differences in concurrently collected SUS means and UMUX-LITE means. There, I believe it's 13. Let's see, it's about 13 independent assessments. And I didn't talk much about GPA, but if you're assigning grades, then you can quantify that just by doing standard GPA. A B plus is a 3.7. Oh, I've got an error here. Oh no, the SUS GPA, never mind, no error. An A minus is a 3.7, a B plus is a 3.3. So with this quantification, you can look at both differences in raw score and look at the mean there, or once you've clumped these things together into grades using the curve grading scale that Jeff and I developed, what happens there. So the mean difference for raw scores across these studies is the difference between the difference between the SUS and the UMUX-LITE, less than 1 point on a 100-point scale. And yes, it's not a gigantic sample size, but if we do a confidence interval across the data we have, it looks like it's constrained to, maybe positive 1.3 to negative 2.5 points. So it's, they're showing what I would consider to be a pretty good level of correspondence. And when you look at that as GPAs, then again, we've got, it could be like half a grade point off to maybe as much as 0.2 in the other direction. But the confidence intervals are reasonably narrow. They include 0, which means that no difference is plausible. And the confidence limits also show that larger differences than those that we're estimating here are also not plausible. The bottom line is the correspondence looks pretty good. And what that means is that you can reasonably use the large body of SUS norms for the interpretation of the UMUX-LITE. In early work with the UMUX-LITE, if you dig into that research, you're going to find a regression equation that we came up with in our 2013 data that we no longer use. That's this UMUX-LITE R, and these charts show why we don't use it. The data we developed that regression equation from were from products that had only kind of average levels of perceived usability, and the consequently, it tends not to be very accurate for products with higher levels of perceived usability. But now that we've collected more data than what we had in 2013, it looks pretty clear that the UMUX-LITE works well across the whole range, whether it's a B or lower or a B plus or better on the curve grading scale. You can see that it does a pretty good job of correspondence at both levels. So when we talk about using the UMUX-LITE, well, as an ultra-short standardized measure of perceived usability, you can also take advantage of it being a TAM-like measure by having one item related to perceived usefulness, the other related to perceived ease of use. It is a fairly easily understood business metric that you can use either in place of or in addition to Net Promoter Scores, especially when users are unlikely to engage in recommendation behavior, because that's what drives people crazy, is when you ask me to recommend and recommendation behavior isn't appropriate. It's useful in surveys when there's limited real estate, and we found it to be useful in usability studies as well. So if you personally have an interest in the UMUX-LITE, however, I showed you 13 studies. Those are the only 13 that I know of. It probably would be prudent to use them both for some period of time to make sure that there isn't something about your context of research that's making them not compatible. What kind of research context? As I mentioned, traditional usability testing, traditional experimental designs, definitely use in retrospective evaluation and surveys. And we have been very comfortable doing confidence interval estimation with them, comparing means using either t-test or analysis of variance, and in using the curve grading scale for its normative evaluation. So what's the future of it? Well, it has acceptable psychometric properties and it's parsimonious. We have the open source norms that I just talked about for the SUS, which are the gold standard, but the close correspondence means that the UMUX can piggyback on those open source norms. This new research shows the expected relationship between the UMUX-LITE and TAM components. There are times the UMUX-LITE is going to be more contextually appropriate than likelihood to recommend. And it's already been adopted for use. They're using it at IBM. A lot of the clients at Measuring U are using it. And I've got a couple of papers over here where this is not my research, but others are picking it up in the industry and reporting reasonable success with it. Right now, the only languages in which it's available are English, Italian, and Slovene. So hopefully at some point that will change. So anyway, just concluding, is the usability construct a dead end? No, I'd say no. It seems to be actually quite useful. References and just a little blurb on where I'm from. So any questions with that last part?
Yeah, there's a question in the chat there. So the question I do with the study you did, the last study you covered, the recent work. The question was whether whether you use the same groups or different groups for the different things that you talked about.
Okay, so there were three groups, 3 surveys conducted, and 2 of them were done with the same panel. Now, because of the way I ran that panel, I promised anonymity to those who participated. So it is possible that there were some common participants between the PowerPoint study and the notes study. However, the sample sizes were pretty different. Did I report what they were? Let me step up here. Up, there we go. Hold it. Okay, so it would not be possible for them to be completely overlapped. And the way participation in my panel usually ran is, you know, people participated if they were able to, and they didn't participate if they weren't able to, and people are differentially busy at different times. So I cannot know the amount of overlap. However, I know that no one in the Slovenian group participated in either of the other two.
All right, well, maybe we'll leave it there. It was a very thorough answer to and a very thorough presentation. I want to thank you very much for that. And now I know Ilona would like to, I'll hand it over to Ilona, who would like to take us through a little activity.
Well, yeah, before we jump into the activity, thank you so much, Jim. That was really fabulously interesting and enlightening and encouraging. Maybe our job is getting slightly easier thanks to people like you who are doing all this work.